In our final look at the Ming and Qing dynasties, we'll concentrate on the economy of the so-called Middle Kingdom. As we mentioned in our last lecture, merchant activity was not highly respected in the traditional Confucian context, even though China did a thriving trade with the rest of the world as an exporting colossus. Chinese products, particularly silks and porcelain and later tea, were highly valued in other parts of the globe, and a large and important trade continued for many hundreds of years. On the import side of the trade ledger, the Chinese brought little back into the Middle Kingdom. They imported some spices and animal skins from Southeast Asia, which were highly valued for their ornamental qualities, and some wool and textiles from Europe, but in fact there was far greater demand for Chinese goods outside of China than the Chinese had for imported goods, which allowed the imperial court to conclude that the dynasty produced everything it needed for its subjects. In payment for its exports, China received silver. The Spanish brought Mexican and Latin American silver into the Philippines, where it was exchanged for Chinese goods. Eventually, silver became one of the bimetallic bases for the Chinese currency, along with copper. As we noted, the most important items of the Chinese export trade during the late Ming and early Qing dynasties were silk, porcelain, and tea. Each of these contributed substantially to the growth of the Chinese economy. Silk was something that only the wealthiest Europeans were able to afford, not least because of the cost of the trip from China and the fragility of the product, making Chinese silk quite expensive. During the Ming dynasty, transcontinental trade over the land routes of the Silk Road declined as sea trade increased, led at first by Portuguese and Spanish mariners, and then by British, Dutch, and French trading companies. Europeans also coveted Chinese porcelain and ceramics. The sheer volume of porcelain pieces imported into Europe was staggering, and it had significant cultural implications as well. The Dutch trading company brought in more than 350,000 pieces of porcelain in 1644. By the 1690s, porcelain dealers in Batavia estimated they received shipments of 2 million pieces a year. Tea was also a huge export crop. It was first introduced to Europe as a medicinal herb and then as a safe alternative to liquor, in particular gin. It was first sold in London in 1657 and shortly thereafter began to be taxed, eventually accounting for nearly a tenth of the British tax income. By the early 18th century, Britain was importing 15 million pounds of tea annually. The economic gains of the Ming and Qing dynasties were not limited to exports. China itself was a vast domestic market with few restrictions to the movement of goods across provincial boundaries. At its base was an agrarian economy that fed goods into a huge network of local markets where crops and goods were exchanged. Over time, many of these local markets that met once or twice a week evolved into standing stores, that operated every day, tended by a growing merchant class. The use of a monetary system based on two metals, again copper and silver, required that money changers be available at these markets. These currency exchanges soon broadened into supplying credit and providing remittances that enabled merchants to travel freely without carrying burdensome sacks of metal coins. In an area as large as China, transportation systems are crucial. One in particular merits our attention: the Grand Canal, the longest artificial river in the world, stretching 1,100 miles and connecting to other major tributaries, including the Yellow and Yangtze rivers. The Grand Canal channeled grain, salt, and other important commodities to the Qing dynasty's capital of Beijing in the north from Hangzhou in the south, and linked to large population centers all along its course. It provided substantial tax revenues for the Ming and Qing dynasties and thus was essential to the maintenance of the imperial court. If we take all these factors into consideration, China's export powerhouse, its thriving domestic economy, and its engineering genius, we might well ask, why didn't China rise to rule the world during this period? Because at this time, there's no question that China was the world's most advanced society. As we move into the 17th and 18th centuries, that superiority is on the wane. In point of fact, Technological innovation languishes under the Ming and Qing dynasties, and by the 19th century, it was very clear that the Chinese were paying a price for it. The conservatism that we mentioned in an earlier lecture, the refusal of the Confucian scholar bureaucrats to innovate or even consider anything new as potentially worthwhile, brought a kind of paralysis to the Ming and Qing courts. Most of all, the courts feared political instability. Looking at the peasant unrest and periodic famines that marked the close of the Ming dynasty and the political rebellions that resulted, we see that this fear had a strong basis in fact. The Mandarin response was to put a lid on the kind of innovation that was beginning to revolutionize both commerce and warfare in Europe, in ways that clearly differentiated from the Chinese approach to technological change. Finally, we arrive at the question of human capital and how it is best employed. One constant in Chinese history that leads us to the present is China's enduring oversupply of labor. So if there's a choice between looking for productivity, that is, looking to increase the output per worker, or simply finding more workers to do the job, the Chinese generally choose to throw more labor at a task because those workers are always available and always cheap. It's just another way in which innovation, particularly technological innovation, is stifled. And there's a dynamic that we see consistently in Chinese society and history, and it's this. The quest for stability and the desire for consistency and constancy is very powerful. Did the Chinese pay a price for that desire? How much was it? What are the consequences of rejecting change? As we'll discover in the coming weeks, these are questions that go to the heart of history from 1500 to the present. Until next time, best wishes.